Welcome to Supply Circles, stories from the innovators, disruptors, and improvers in supply chain management today. Brought to you by AI Group.
Yes, indeed. Hello, I'm James Scotland, coming to you today from the Yunganbar language region. And this is the Business Improvement Podcast that asks the question, how can we in Australia create supply chains that are resilient and sustainable at a time where we're implementing the 3Ds, digitalisation, decarbonisation, and the diversification of our risk profile, especially in our extended supply chains. Each fortnight, I delve into different sections of the end-to-end supply chain. I chat with fascinating and interesting people, and we try to have some fun along the way. Speaking of fascinating and interesting people, my guest today is Jim Wilson from Shipping Australia. Hello, Jim.
Hello, James. Thank you very much for having me on the show. Much appreciated.
Pleasure to chat with you. Tell me about Shipping Australia and the Jim Wilson story.
Sure. The Jim Wilson story is pretty simple. I'm a former journalist. I've worked in the maritime industry since 2000. Prior to that, I did an advanced law degree. I've worked as a reporter in London, Dubai, Singapore, latterly Australia. During that time, I've covered pretty much everything you can think of in relation to the international ocean shipping markets, corporate succession, family companies, bunker fuel, fraud, maritime terrorism, maritime security, international container shipping markets, some of which I think we're going to touch on today. And in relation to Shipping Australia, we are the trade association, the peak body for the shipping industry that works in Australia. We focus particularly on the freight carrying sector. And so, excluding maritime activities that wouldn't carry freight, so we wouldn't really cover passenger traffic. We particularly represent the international ocean shipping companies that are working in Australia. Our members include some of the biggest, largest ocean shipping companies that carry vast volumes of freight. And we were founded in 1912 as the overseas representatives. We've been through a few name changes in that time. We're still fundamentally doing the same job now that we were doing approximately 150 years ago.
Tell you what, though, shipping is fundamentally different from 1912, isn't it? I mean, back in those days, it was cranes and nets and lower the net into the hole and pack it and then lift it off. Now it's all very computerized, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. There's some really fantastic old photojournalism from back in the day. And, there was a few early photojournalists working on the Australian waterfront. The Australian waterfront and waterfronts all around the world were a much larger part of everyday life than they were back then. My own grandfather was a stevedore, for example. These days, everything is, secured both for health and safety reasons, because you can't have people walking around cargo. It's dangerous. And also, from a maritime security perspective, everything has to be locked away now. The 9/11 attacks, kind of increase worldwide security in all transport sectors. So, if you look back in the day, you saw large gangs of people moving, bales of cotton, everything you could think of, basically. Today, all the general kind of cargo we think of is pretty much coming in container or exporting in container. So it's a radically different environment. Everything, I won't say everything, but certainly all general cargo, general goods, things like furniture, iPhones, medicine, pharmaceuticals. I'll stop there because I could go on for a very long time just listing everything that goes into cars. Did you even know wine is transported in containers these days? So sometimes is grain, which you used to make, bread in places like Southeast Asia. And we're even starting to see the birth, and this is particularly exciting, we're starting to see the birth of a new container trade. International car manufacturers are increasingly moving cars around the world inside containers. That's something that's pretty new.
I think a few friends of mine probably would be interested in buying a container of wine. It might be cheaper for them in the long run.
It's pretty fascinating.
The former journalists would probably buy containers of wine, wouldn't they?
It sounds like a good idea now. You mentioned maybe I should have a few containers in my backyard. So what happens is you have a giant inflatable bladder. You stick a hose in. I'm grossly simplifying here, and then you basically fill it up with wine, and away it goes. So it's a really cheap and effective way for our exporters to get their wine to market, and it's particularly useful in places where, perhaps the logistics infrastructure isn't as developed as Australia. And that's also works really well with regional bakeries in places like rural Southeast Asia. Some of those customers could not afford a giant bulk ship full of grain, but they can afford, container or even half a container or a quarter of a container that's full of wheat flour. So it's a really good way of serving different levels of customers, different market differentiation, different customers, different needs. Look, the international ocean shipping industry is vitally important to Australia. We can't even begin to overstress just how important it is. Our exports and imports, this unfortunately includes intangible services, out of and into Australia, accounted for just under 26% of our gross product and 19% in terms of imports in 2022, according to World Bank data. Now, I have to include the intangible services there because that's what how the World Bank reports it. If we look at the actual volume and value of freight itself, in 2020 to 2021, that was about 1.61 billion tons. So 1.6 billion tons of cargo, valued at about $601 billion Australian. That's about 99.93% of everything that moves into or out of this country goes by sea.
Yeah, I think in previous podcasts we talked about the fact that that most stuff comes in and out of Australia by sea. We're an island, so it comes by sea. High. There's low volume but high value in air freight, but everything else comes by sea. Yeah.
Well, exactly. I mean, 99.93% of everything is pretty much everything in my view.
Close enough. Yeah, even wine. One of the things that is often forgotten is that once upon a time, we're talking about 1912 or whatever, it was actually dangerous. There were cargo nets lowered into holds. People were lowered into holes. They put the general goods in these nets. The nets were winched up and then they were hand loaded onto trucks where many things fell off the back of a truck. Well, oops, that one's fallen off.
It's been heard of.
And then we went to containers, and we went out with this thing called a 20-foot container. Talk about that to me for a few minutes if you can. They're called TEUs. How's it work?
Sure. Well, a 20-foot container is, as the name suggests, it's a container that's 20 foot long. Now, the height of the container might differ slightly because you get high cube containers. The fundamentally important thing, and this is one of those little things that led to big results, right? One of the reasons why the modern world is the way the modern world is because of a guy called Martin McLean. And in or about 1952, 1956, he had a brilliant idea. He was apparently, so the legend goes, was watching the trucks coming in and out of the port. And he was watching this loading process you were describing. And he said, why can't we just pick up the truck and stick it in the ship? And he thought about that for a little while, and he realized what you needed to do was to put everything inside a big box and put the box inside the ship. Now, I'm cutting out a lot of history here, but what this led to was a standardized size of container. And the international shipping industry got together after they'd worked all this out and said, and there was an engineer actually by the name of Keith Tantlinger, and he did some phenomenally important work, a real, kind of unsung hero of international business, international logistics. Anyway, between them all, they came up with the same size container. So it doesn't matter where in the world your truck is, the container will fit on it. They came up with the same locking mechanism. So no matter where in the world, the locking mechanism will fit and it will lock. And they came up with a concept for a ship, what we call today a fully cellular ship. So it's basically a ship that takes containers. And they came up with it so it would be the same design. And so the same box will go in the ship, no matter where it is in the world. So whether you're putting Nepalese cargo in a Chinese-made box in a Greek-made vessel, it doesn't matter. Everything fits together. Now, there was a study of a breakbulk vessel called, I believe, the Warrior back in the late 1950s. And breakbulk vessels, what we used to have, the method of loading you described, they used to spend weeks and weeks in port being loaded. Yes, there was pilferage. Yes, there was lots of accidental damage. Lots and lots of problems generally. They'd spend a couple of weeks sailing across the Atlantic and then take weeks and weeks and weeks to be loaded in somewhere in Europe. The Ideal X was able to do all that within an afternoon. That was the first ever voyage of anything approaching a container ship. It was actually a tanker that had been converted on the top deck so it could take containers. And the study of the Warrior, I forget the details now, but it was something like $50 a ton back in 1950s dollars. And the Ideal X was more on the scale, the cost of the cargo was more on the scale of 50 cents a ton. It was just that level of difference. Now, when you have something that is that massively cheaper and that much more massively efficient, it cannot fail to take over. And that's exactly what happened. And this is the reason why.
The ultimate disruption.
It was major disruption, and it was right, looking back with hindsight, obviously, I don't want to take anything away from Malcolm McLean. He was obviously had that spark of innovation and genius that, alas, the rest of us, 99.9% infinity of humans lack. He saw something in the humble box that the rest of us didn't. And his innovation, his invention, and everything that flew from that, and especially the work of Keith Tatlinger, the engineer, it changed everything. Within 20 years, all the break bulk system had been, I wouldn't say the entire break bulk system was gone because we still have break bulk vessels, but everything changed. Loading went from weeks to hours. Costs went from many tens of dollars a ton to cents a ton. This is why you can ship cheap plastic novelty items that go inside crackers and ship them halfway across the world, and they're still economically viable to do it.
One of the things that happened, though, Jim, was during COVID, we discovered that this incredibly complex, highly efficient system around the world where we've got ships coming in and containers being offloaded very quickly and going back out again, operating all around the world, and we discovered that it can fall over quite quickly if you have a major obstruction in the system, a system thinking. And if you stuff the system up in one part, the whole lot throws out. Shanghai port closes, or Rotterdam, and the whole thing's out for months. Is that what we learned, or is that just the outsider's view of what happened?
Well, I think it's a really interesting view, and I certainly have heard other people say that. People talk about maritime supply chains being fragile, and it's just not true. Maritime supply chains are resilient. The system does not fall over. And the classic example of that is the one you've just mentioned, COVID. The job of a ship is to get from A to B with cargo. Now, if you look at what actually happened in COVID, ships were being loaded in Asia, and I'll take the example of North America. They were being loaded in Asia, sailing across the Pacific Ocean, and arriving at North America, particularly Los Angeles, particularly Long Beach. The job of the ship is done. It's gone from A to B with cargo. The problem happened, and this happened all around the world, the problem happened is when the ships got to port, they couldn't be unloaded in time because the ports couldn't cope with the surge in demand. Now, there's a couple of issues around that. Obviously, one is, when you have something as amazing and crazy and strange as COVID happening, it puts a massive stress on everyone, everywhere. So there was that. And, to be fair to the ports, there is such a thing as hard infrastructure. I mean, it's hard to go and build a new port. You can't just do it overnight. That said, in the current issue, which is the Red Sea, which I'm sure we're going to talk about shortly, in the Red Sea crisis, there was congestion of up to 7 days at Singapore. Now, the difference was Singapore has taken action. It's put more labor on, it put extra cranes on, it's opened up all berths, and it's absolutely done its best to really try and help to reduce the congestion. Last time I checked it, it went down from 7 to 3 days, which is still a lot, but, you can really try. You can tell they're really trying to alleviate the congestion.
But from a supply chain point of view, there's that's where the flaw is. If you can put a container ship into a port with 40,000 containers on it, but I don't have any port space and I don't have any trucks to clear it, all I'm doing is causing a problem rather than creating an efficient system. So we need that kind of integrated, the full integrated system where all parts of the containers system works well. And I think we saw it's hard to make it work sometimes, isn't it?
Well, that sure is. One of the things we kept saying was that during the COVID crisis, everyone was saying it was a shipping crisis, and we kept saying it's not a shipping crisis. It's a port congestion crisis. There was no crisis in shipping. The ships were sailing around the world freely. As my colleague...
I think we did have trouble getting ships to Australia, though, didn't we?
No, they were coming.
I thought there was a shortage of ships in the southern hemisphere because they were all doing the Shanghai to Long Beach run.
Well, it's an interesting view, but I don't think the statistics bear that out. I mean, there were port calls. The ships were coming to the port. There's a really simple, quick, and fast and easy way you can tell if ships are arriving or not arriving, and it's this: go to your supermarket, go to your retail store, go to your furniture store, have a look around. Are the shelves stocked with goods, or the shelves not stocked with goods? If the shelves are not stocked with goods, you might have a problem with international shipping. If the shelves are stocked with goods, it's there. Now, when you had a look at the COVID crisis, there were some supply chain issues, but they were mostly localized supply chain issues, issues with trucking, issues with ports. We did not see a shortfall of vessels coming to Australia. If I remember correctly, there were actually queues of vessels. Now, this actually became a big point of contention during the pandemic because one of the general media allegedly did a, quote, fact check. And they said, well, if you go down to port, you won't see any queues. And that was true. You wouldn't physically see a port queue. That queue was there. Even though if you couldn't see it with your eyes, it was there. What was happening is the ships were slowing down. So if you're sailing a ship across the ocean, that doesn't come to free. You have to spend fuel. You have to burn fuel. Fuel comes at a cost, anywhere between a few $100 up to $600 a ton to up to $1,100 a ton. Now, because water is so thick and viscous compared to, say, air, you have to burn a lot of fuel to overcome the resistance in the water. So if you're going fast and then you turn up at the port and there's nowhere for the ship to be berthed or to go in, then there's no point burning fast. You might as well go slow. The slower you go, the more you save. So
Sure.
a ship that is sailing very slowly will save heaps of money on fuel. It's because the cost of fuel and the consumption rate changes rapidly. So if you think about your car, this is a good example of what ships don't do. If you think about your car, you floor it, and if you were to plot the time and distance on a graph, you'd pretty much have a straight line. If you were to do that with a ship, you end up with a hockey stick, a J-curve. And the more you go, faster you go, you start consuming disproportionately more fuel. So if you're going from, say, 3 knots to 4 knots, you're not going to burn a lot more fuel. If you're going from, say, 24 knots to 25 knots, you're going to burn heaps of fuel, much, much more. So what you do in these
doesn't solve the problem of the port, though. I mean, I get the idea. Yes, is what there was ships off the coast, but we still had congestions on the port. But that raises the issue of, do we really need to go to bigger ships? I know that in Australia we don't get the huge container ships, but on some of the big ports, Rotterdam, they have massive ships, don't they? They have like 60,000 containers per vessel.
Yeah, so the thing is, what everyone gets confused about, ships don't make the cargo flow. It's the other way around. Cargo flow makes the size of the ships. Places like Rotterdam have huge ships because the European population is huge.
Sure. That's what I'm saying. We don't see the huge ships either. You got to go over there to see they're big buggers. How's it working globally now? Has it all been repaired since COVID? Is it all back working smoothly? No hiccups anywhere?
It's been up and come down and come back up again. So
what's happening?
Yeah, so look, I was in a conference and last year, around about this time last year or the year before, the general word was, if you had a look at what the analysts were saying, people were saying, oh, I'm making $100 a box or I'm making nothing a box. And people were saying, I'd rather send my crew fishing than actually have them sail a vessel because rates were terrible. Today, rates are not terrible. Rates are very high all around the world. On the Asia to Oceania, according to the Ningbo Containerized Freight Exchange, they're estimating between $2,000 to $2,500 a box. Now, it's radically different on the major population trade routes like the Asia-Europe. You're talking more like $7,500 a box for a 40-footer. So we've had the COVID, we've had the fallout from the COVID boom, and we've had a resurgence of a boom. So container shipping is charging huge rates at the moment. And the reason for that, of course, is the Red Sea crisis.
So what's the Red Sea crisis?
So you may recall back in the news, around about October, I believe September, October, November last year, there was a terrorist attack in Israel by, I believe it was Hamas. And then that sparked a major conflict between Israel and Gaza and the Hamas authorities in Gaza. Over on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, there's a country called Yemen. And that's been experiencing a multi-sided civil war for decades now. There's a group in there called Ansar Allah, or as we commonly know it, the Houthis, and it was named after their leader. And they decided, or at least they'd already decided, they announced and declared they were allied with Hamas. And in a show of support and solidarity and an attempt to put pressure on Israel, they announced they would start attacking shipping going through the Red Sea. So the Red Sea runs through the region and to the south of Yemen. Now, what's particularly important here is Yemen is very close to Africa, and it produces a pinch point called the Bab el-Mandeb, which is about 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, and there's an island in the middle. That means if shipping is going through that area, it's all funneled into more or less the same area. And the Houthis started attacking vessels. And
Early. Gee.
Yeah, it was really dangerous. It was and is really dangerous. So
Goodness.
it was and is really dangerous. And they started attacking vessels with a variety of weaponry, including, if I remember rightly, anti-ship ballistic missiles, aerial drones. They latterly started attacking vessels with waterborne drones. These are basically speedboats, and they have some kind of guidance system on them. We think it's remote controlled. And the reason we think that is when you typically see a remote controlled, or rather, when you see a small watercraft coming in to attack a ship, there's often a chase vessel following behind it. So the speculation is that it's being radio controlled, like a radio controlled car. And then
I imagine this means that the insurance companies or the board of directors are saying don't go through the Red Sea. But is there an alternate route, or is there just a higher risk?
Yeah, so look, I mean, what we're seeing is when the vessels are being attacked, what we saw immediately is container shipping deviated around South Africa.
Wow.
Which is a huge way to go around. And a lot of the dry bulk companies carried on sending their vessels, and the tankers kept sending their vessels through the Red Sea. Initially, the Houthis were saying we're only attacking Israeli-linked vessels, but they appear to have defined that very broadly, and it's hard now to discern what pattern they're using for targeting attack. They appear to be attacking vessels randomly now. And the container ships pretty much all deviated around South Africa almost straight away, and the bulkers kept going through. But even now, the bulkers and the tankers are now starting to not go through the Red Sea.
But if you went through South Africa, that would add time to the voyage, so you're going to lose your on-time delivery and costs, I would imagine. I mean,
absolutely.
The wonder the cost per box has gone up.
Absolutely, it would add costs. So you save a bit of money not going through the Suez Canal, but you add a lot of money in terms of time and fuel. If you're going a lot further, then you burn a lot more fuel, just like you would in a normal car. What a lot of people don't realize about shipping is a lot of the operating companies don't own the ships. They hire them off somewhere else. So if you look at, say, a 2,500 TEU vessel, so it can take 2,500 20-foot boxes, you're paying at $28,000, $30,000 a day to hire that vessel. So if you now take an extra few weeks getting them from A to B, going around South Africa, inevitably your costs as a shipping company go up. And for a much larger vessel, it's much more cost that you have to pay. Then the fuel, you're burning a lot more fuel because you're at sea for a lot longer before you get to destination. So the fuel cost in total goes up. You're paying more money for your seafarers. Now, from a logistics viewpoint, so yes, obviously costs are going to increase. From a logistics viewpoint, that means you need to have extra vessels to man the route because you massively increase your time and your distance. So this is what the shipping companies did. They started hiring in vessels from the international charter markets. There is a limit to how many ships there exist at any given point in time, which is currently around 6,200-ish for the international container fleet. We talk about the vessels that are moving not on commercial hire and not in repair or being maintained as the idle fleet. That has gone. There is no more idle fleet.
Yeah, right.
Last time I checked, and that was about a week ago, it was about 0.7% of the world fleet. So you're talking about 30, 40 vessels out of a fleet of 6,200. You basically can't hire a ship anymore. There are no more ships to hire.
No wonder the costs are up. Yeah.
And that's why
so what does it mean for Australia? It means that we got delays in getting goods in. We're getting much increased costs.
Well, exactly. So for Australia, we get most of our cargo from North Asia and Southeast Asia, and most of that's transit through Singapore. And while we're not mostly directly affected by the troubles in the Red Sea, we are to a degree. About 11% of our total box trade, import and export, goes to and from Europe. So that means those vessels are directly affected, and that cargo is directly affected by the Red Sea. However, the global shipping market is just that. It's global. What happens of a major nature in one part of the world affects all ships everywhere. If the global charter market is sold out, then the global charter market is sold out, and that affects Australian shipping, Australian import and export of cargo, because it means our costs go up indirectly. It means the schedules, as we discussed before, the schedule reliability declines because vessels can't make it at the time because of gaps in the schedule and gaps in the service.
Are we expecting this to last? Is it going to remain a problem for a while? Sounds like it.
That's a really good question. I've seen senior CEOs of the major international shipping companies are talking about this lasting for a long time. Yeah, I had a look at also the forward freight futures markets in Shanghai, I believe. I mean, possibly in both. And they seem, as you know, when you have financial traders and operational traders bet on the future of a market, they're basically laying a bet as to what the future will be. We're talking if they're right and if they're putting their freight contracts, forward freight contracts right, then you could be talking about this for months yet. There are, I think, two main likely reasonable scenarios. If for some reason, I won't comment on the reason why, but if for some reason the Red Sea violence were to cease for some reason, so for example, peace deal or some other reason, then I think we would see the international container shipping return to normal pretty quickly. And not only would it turn to normal, then there would be massive overcapacity in the market. The thing we all have to remember is the international shipping industry has delivered a vast amount of ships and containers. One of the reasons why the freight rates were so poor last year is because there was too much capacity in the market. And if the Red Sea violence were to cease for any reason, suddenly, then we would be pretty much back into that territory pretty quickly. Now, how realistic that is, I will leave to the geopolitical analysts. The other scenario, which I can see being reasonable, is the ocean shipping industry will continue to put orders in for ships and continue to put new orders in for new boxes. And eventually what we will have is capacity, supply will match demand, but for the longer trade route. And then I think we will see things normalize because then supply and demand will match. It will take everyone longer to get their goods because they're going around the Red Sea. Then I can foresee what would happen is at some point in the future, there would be some kind of peace settlement perhaps. And then we're back in a situation of massive overcapacity again.
Well, what we would prefer, of course, is massive overcapacity and all deliveries on time. If you can make that happen, Jim, that'd be great. Our costs would go down. The other problem that came up in the news a while ago, had an update, was the Panama. Wasn't that dry? Wasn't the Panama Canal suffering from a lack of water due to droughts, and they couldn't get ships through there? So that's the other canal. What's going on there?
So, yeah, you're right. The Panama watershed area, the canal watershed. So the Panama Canal cuts right through the country, and a lot of people don't realize this. It's not a canal all the way through. It's a giant lake, Lake Gatun, and it needs to have a certain water level. And not only is it used to allow ships to sail through the country, it's also the catchment area for the drinking water for a large portion of the population of Panama. So we have two competing demands on the water in Lake Gatun and the associated lakes and rivers, and that is drinking water and water for transport. Now, as you can probably imagine, drinking water has to take priority. Drinking water, cleaning water, cooking water. There was a drought, an unusually severe drought, part of the regular ongoing El Nino, La Nina cycle. So I don't know if your readers are familiar, but there is a complex weather phenomenon. It's one of the reasons why Australia is sometimes dry for years at a time, sometimes very damp for years at a time. This was happening in Panama, and they were in the dry cycle of that. In addition, the population of Panama was growing and having more and more demands for water. Something had to give. Something did give. And that was the lake levels in Lake Gatun. As the lake levels dropped, you lose more and more capacity. The general rule of thumb, for every, I believe this is correct, for every foot or so you lose of lake water in terms of the level, you lose capacity of about 350 boxes per ship. So the Canal Authority quite rightly took action. They started limiting transits through the canal. And then what happened is they started auctioning off slots. So that put costs up over time, because if you wanted to get through the canal, you had to pay more money, and it was a competitive auction process. So that happened for a period of time. It was getting drier and drier and drier. Eventually, the rains did return. So this situation seems to be easing, but it will inevitably take a long time to come back to normal. What the Panamanians are now considering in association with the Panama Canal Authority is they're looking at building extra dams, increasing the water supply, increasing reservoirs, and then looking at managing the drinking water situation for the population, doing things like, extra maintenance, extra repairs, and more water conservation measures. So looking at increasing the total volume of water and increasing the efficiency of the water transport system in Panama. A big, big job. And all of this affects logistics in Australia.
Yeah, all of it. All right, we should take a break. When we come back, let's talk about the decarbonising of the shipping industry and also the efficiency of Australian ports. This is a good chat. I'm talking to Jim Wilson. Hey, before we go, Jim, is there such a thing as a former journalist? Was a journalist always a journalist?
I would say so. You never quite lose the nosiness or sometimes the bolshiness and aggressiveness. And I still take photographs every now and then. So, yeah, I'll probably never get out of my blood.
When I was at high school, they said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "So this high school back in the early '80s." They said, "What's your career goals?" And I said, "I'm going to be a journalist in Hong Kong. I'm going to write startling columns in the morning and then get drunk at the Far East Correspondents Club in Hong Kong." That was my goal. Never achieved it, but I was going to be a drunken curmudgeon journalist was my goal. Yeah.
Are you telling me you never got drunk in the Correspondents Club in Hong Kong?
No, I went there once and it was closed.
Oh. How disappointing.
Devastating. So I went and got drunk. Yeah. All right, we'll come back in a second.
The largest Australian workplace changes in over a decade
Underpaying
are about to
workers
impact
could
your
result
business.
in crippling fines.
There'll be new rules about when a casual employee
The laws are
has the right
employees will have the right to
Disconnect. Workplace laws are changing. Pay attention or pay the price. Safeguard your business with Australian Industry Group. The legal experts at Australian Industry Group will help you navigate the new legislation and prepare your business for the changes. Become a member today at aigroup.com.au.
Jim, one of the issues that comes up all the time is the ports. We were talking about it before. The ships are working okay. The system works reasonably well. But then when it gets to ports, it's a problem. Do you want to talk about that? This is a supply chain focused podcast, and so logistics is the underpinning part of the whole supply chain. What's going on? Are our ports as good as they can be?
Look, I think the simple answer to that is no. There is something wrong with our ports. There needs to be an investigation to determine the root cause of it. But it is clear, increasingly clear from data, there is a problem. So, back in 2020, the World Bank stunned the port world and the shipping world by releasing a big report. And what they did is they got the world's best data from the world's best data collection company, and they put it all together in a big report, and they analyzed it in two separate ways. And they had some of the world's leading transport economists to analyze the data. And to cut a long story short, there were 350 container ports in that report that were analysed and cross-analysed and compared to each other. And the Australian ports pretty much came near the bottom of the list. We're talking like 340s, 320s.
Seriously?
Seriously. So
wow.
There was multiple different measures of efficiency. They spent a long time, and the data is in. Now, this isn't a one-off, because the World Bank repeated that report the next year, and the results were the same. They repeated it again, and the results were the same. And they repeated the report again last year, the 2023 report. And if anything, the Australian port performance got worse because
But the problem is that we're only got small ports, isn't it? Isn't it that we're, we don't have economies of scale like Long Beach or Rotterdam or Shanghai? It's just little ports. It's always going to be inefficient.
I disagree, because there are so many ports in the world, and you're able to compare like with like. So we, at Shipping Australia, we had a look, and we turned around and said, well, look, you need to have places that are culturally similar. And there's a tool you can use called the Hofstede Insights Analysis tool. Helps you make comparisons between culturally similar ports. Culturally similar countries. So we analysed ports in the UK, Canada, United States, as they're kind of socially and culturally similar to Australia. We looked at ports in terms of volume, and we matched them against ports that were doing similar container volumes. So we wouldn't match, say, Singapore, which has got 35, 36, 42 million TEU against, say, Port Botany, which is about 2.5, 3 million. Yes, that would be silly. So we matched like ports with like ports. And we also looked at the geographical location. Was there a city around it? Was there a bay? Was it on a river? Was there a bridge over it? Is it constrained? We matched it as much as we could.
And what happened?
And we had a look, and we still found Australian ports are at the bottom of the table when you compare them to other ports. So, and the other thing is,
what's the problem?
Container shipping, as I indicated before, it's all the same. Malcolm McLean and Keith Tanlinger made sure of that. They made sure the boxes were the same size. They made sure the containers were the same. They made sure the ships were the same. They made sure the trucks were the same. So why is it Australian ports perform so badly when everything is comparable and is the same? Doesn't make sense. I also went...
Is it because they are landlocked? They're in the middle of cities?
No, not a factor. Not a factor. If you look at Charlotte in the United States, it's not only landlocked and in a bay and around a river, and it still performs better than all the Australian ports. How can that be? It's got so much going against it, but it's still so much better. How is that possible?
Interesting.
I had a look at 20 years' worth of reports from the Australian Competition Consumer Commission. I sat there, spent hours reading these. I wrote down every instance of investment I could find, whether that was a small little crane, a big crane, a suite of cranes, or a giant new container terminal. Over those 20 years, there was billions of dollars in investment in Australian ports. And in all that time, box moves per hour per crane, and that's as pure a measure as you can get. Box moves per hour per crane was about 28 throughout the 20-odd years. Went up a little bit sometimes, went down a little bit sometimes, more or less 28. How is it, despite billions of dollars of investment over 20 years, port performance has not improved? That, I think, is damning.
Yeah, good question. Good question. Going back to the global container shipping industry, what's their performance like? Is there a measurement that says, yes, they stick to their schedules 80% of the time or 60%? What's it like? And what are the variables?
Well, we mentioned some of that before. The global schedule reliability that Sea Intelligence produced says it's currently around, I think I said 55, 58%. Sometimes it's been as high as 80%. Sometimes it's been as low as 4%. The key thing to remember about global shipping is there's very little on the sea that actually stops a container ship. It's not like there's roundabouts or traffic light systems in the middle of the ocean. Ships go from A to B. If there is a delay in an upset or a disruption in container shipping, it is almost inevitably caused by port disruptions. Classic case on this, if a ship arrives at Brisbane and it's delayed, then it's delayed when it gets to Sydney. Then it's delayed again when it gets to Melbourne. Then it's delayed again when it gets to Adelaide. Then it's delayed again when it gets to Fremantle. There's only 1 or 2 days sailing between these times. But each time, what you'll find is the detractors of the shipping industry blame the ships. Oh, the ships are late. They've been late 5 to 6 times around Australia. But they're not late because of ships or shipping. They're late because of port inefficiency and port delay.
Interesting. Well, the other issue that we should talk about is decarbonisation. It's a critical part of the net zero equation of being able to get to a post-carbon world. And there's a lot of pressure on the transport industry in every sector, air, ships, road, whatever. What's the shipping industry doing about moving to a cleaner fuel source?
Shipping industry is doing a huge amount. In many ways, the ocean shipping industry is ahead of the regulators. About a couple of years ago now, a few years ago now, one of the major ocean shipping companies stunned the world when they said, we're moving now. We've bought 14 vessels, which is a massive investment. We're moving now to methanol, which is a kind of alcohol. Now, alcohol...
the shipping industry is moving to alcohol. We're back to that story again.
They're moving to burn alcohol rather than drinking it over lunch. I'm sure that happens from time to time.
Anyway, sorry.
So they're moving to burn methanol. So methanol is a fuel with a little tiny bit of carbon in it. Now, the key thing about this is you make it using renewable power, so solar or wind power, and then you can make methanol from oxygen and hydrogen, which you can do by splitting water. And then you add a little bit of carbon to it. Now, that carbon comes from biomass. So you think of forestry residue or farm residue, even sewage residue, sewage biomass. You put it in a digester, you sprinkle some of the appropriate bugs on it, and they create or give off carbon monoxide. When you mix that with oxygen and hydrogen in the right amounts and treat it the right way, you make methanol, which is a form of alcohol, and that you can burn in a ship's engine. And when you combust it, yes, you do get carbon dioxide emissions because the carbon in the fuel does react with oxygen in the atmosphere. However, the carbon, if you may recall, came from the atmosphere in the first place because it was drawn down from the atmosphere by the plants or the organic material, incorporated into the body of the plants or the organic material before it was released. So in that way, it's net zero. Now, there's been huge investment in methanol fleet vessels all around the world since. And if I had a look at some of the ships on order, and according to DNV, which is a major class society, a few years ago, there were no methanol-powered vessels in existence, and now we're ordered and in existence somewhere in the order of 304. It's the single fastest growing, it's the single fastest growing order type in the world. methanol is really being heavily ordered. Now, but last year, the International Maritime Organization, which is the international regulator of shipping, following on the heels of industry, agreed that by 2050, international shipping will be carbon-free. And that was a momentous decision, historic. And this puts real pressure on the international shipping industry to change. And it will change because it's going to happen.
You think it'll be biomass will be the main fuel source?
No, I think it's going to be methanol, probably,
right.
which is a chemical fuel with elements of biological carbon in it. Yeah. That is almost certainly going to be the issue. There's also the potential.
So your message to us is that it's moving quite fast. That shipping is going to be a net zero, because that's important for every business person listening here. We need a low carbon transport chain.
Look, it's going to happen for two main reasons. Number one, our customers want it. The world's biggest international shippers, the likes of Walmart, Amazon, Kmart, all these organizations, they are demanding it of international shipping. And Amazon gets what Amazon wants. And Amazon wants those things because we, the general population, are demanding it of them. So it's going to happen because the world populations want it to happen. And business is, or at least should be, sensitive to customer demand. Number two, international regulation. The IMO has mandated it will happen by 2050. So it will happen by 2050. The other main issues is we have a thing called the carbon intensity indicator. Mm-hmm. Now, this would be mathematics full of Greek equations, but the simple answer is transport work done divided by fuel used. That's basically how it works. And over time, we can only imagine that consequences for not meeting the carbon intensity indicator are only going to become more and more severe. At the moment, if you don't meet your carbon intensity indicator, you'll be in the bad books of the major shippers. And that's not a good place to be. We can only imagine that in the future there will be official sanctions as well. So all the trends at the international regulatory level are pointing to greater, stiffer, and more severe regulation of global shipping. And to be fair, the global shipping industry largely welcomes this. We, the shipping industry, are barreling down the track towards decarbonisation.
Yeah. That's good to hear. That's really good to hear, because it's important for our net zero targets. That's good to hear. It's been a great conversation, Jim. We've covered a lot. Tell me what's ahead. What do you think we'll be talking about in 5 years or something like that? When you and I sit down in 5 years, what's it going to be like?
If I had that crystal ball, I'd be a multi-billionaire selling fortunes and predictions to the world industry all over.
I had hoped that you were a multi-billionaire and that you and I were going to be good friends. Is this not the way it's going to work?
I'll be happy to take you for a cheap beer at a happy hour on the local bar.
And vice versa. So no predictions?
Oh, look, there's always going to be issues. Look, 5 years out from now, and I think we're going to be talking about many of the same things, hopefully with a lot more progress. We'll be talking about decarbonisation and looking at how far we've come. We'll be talking about biodiversity and pollution control. That is always an issue. So at the moment, a big issue is invasive species. So this is when creatures that live happily in another part of the world invade somewhere like Australia. So that's always a problem. But there are lots of measures underway to control that. Marine plastics are a big issue and are only going to get bigger. We will see undoubtedly regulatory action on that as well. We will have continuing ongoing challenges from the international geopolitical situation. Today it's the Houthis, tomorrow it might be someone else, might be a new pandemic, might be a new armed conflict. Likely will be lots of industrial relations activity. There always is in Australia. Something Australia desperately needs to reform is its industrial relations. I understand your organisation is pretty hard on that too. But we definitely need industrial relations reform on the waterfront. And I think it is a special case because 99.93% of everything that comes into or goes out of this country goes by sea. And there's the major elephant in the room, the titan on the horizon, and that's robot ships. The day is coming when the ships will be sailed by robots. When that will be, that's pretty much a topic of debate, but robot ships are coming, and that will change everything. So I'm talking here about ships with no human beings on board and operated remotely.
Yeah, autonomous vessels. Yeah. You and I can sit in our bedrooms and control the ships like we control drones.
You can kind of sort of already do that anyway. There's been trials to this effect. And, in the future, they'll have a thing called the Remote Operations Center. And rather than having loads of captains and loads of seafarers all in different parts of the world being exposed to the risks of the weather or geopolitics, you'll have relatively fewer people, much more highly qualified and much more highly paid, but a lot less of them sitting in remote operations centers. The seafarer of tomorrow could well be sitting in Melbourne and he's sailing ships around the world dressed in his bathrobe.
Absolutely. You can do it by drone, you can do it by air, you can do it on the sea. Interesting, you can't do it very easily under the sea. Autonomous submarines make a lot of sense. Don't have any people underwater, just send the things out to protect our shores. But sonar is much more unreliable than radar. You can't send the signals under the sea, but on the surface should not be a problem. We should be able to sail them easily.
Should not be a problem. We have good tracking systems. If you've got the appropriate equipment installed on a vessel and you turn the vessel slightly, the remote operation center, these things already exist for monitoring and tracking, can tell.
Would they be able to go through? Would they be able to go through cyclones and hurricanes a bit easier without people on board?
Well, they don't go through cyclones and hurricanes now, and I can't imagine they would because the forces and scales would be too much. Yeah. Too much. A hurricane is something else.
We've had a good chat. It's been fun. Let's talk again. All the best.
Thank you, James.
All the best, Jim. Thanks.
Thanks, James. It's been fun.
Well, that's it for another episode of Supply Circles. Thanks again to everyone for listening and thanks for your feedback. If you have any feedback on today's interview with Jim Wilson or ideas for the show, or you just want to give me feedback, hit me up at james.scotland@aigroup.com.au or head over to my LinkedIn page. I'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back in a fortnight with more business improvement insights into the keys to building sustainable supply chains. Thanks for joining me. This is Supply Circles. I'm James Scotland. Bye for now.